Tonight at 10, new COVID restrictions in England are not being ruled out before Christmas. As hundreds of thousands of people get their boosters today, ministers say it's still too early to assess the new variant.
There are no guarantees in this pandemic. I don't think at this point we just have to keep everything under review.
We'll have more on the challenges facing Boris Johnson's government as other countries take more drastic decisions. From today, the Netherlands goes into strict lockdown, faced with a deadly surge of the Omicron variant. Worldwide tributes on the death of Richard Rodgers, one of the most influential British architects of modern times.
The 2021 BBC Sports Personality of the Year is Emma Raducanu.
And a fitting end to 2021 for the teenage tennis star who won the US Open. Good evening. Further COVID restrictions in England can't be ruled out over the coming week, according to Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, who also urged people to be cautious given the rapid spread of the Omicron variant. The Mayor of London, Labour Sadiq Khan, says that in his view, more restrictions such as social distancing and limits on household mixing are now inevitable. Extra money has been announced tonight for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in their respective fights against Omicron. Our medical editor Fergus Walsh has the latest.
This Christmas, the hot ticket for many is not to see a football match, but to get a booster jab. Wembley Stadium had 10,000 vaccines available today, and many were keen to get them before heading home to see family.
I would prefer to have it done before Christmas. I've got an elderly grandfather who's 90 years old, so I want to be able to see him.
I'm getting booster vaccinations and my family members have already got the vaccinations, but I think it's best to be as contained as possible.
So it's the booster versus the variant. Omicron infections are thought to be doubling every 2 to 3 days. The epidemic is growing so fast, the Health Secretary could not rule out fresh restrictions before Christmas.
There are no guarantees in this pandemic. I don't think at this point we just have to keep everything under review.
He urged people across the country to be cautious in the days ahead.
If I'm going to see my mum, for example, who's elderly, like most very old people, she's more vulnerable than younger people, I will take a test and I might, just have not the usual amount of hugs I get from my mum. You just take a bit of caution, and I think that's a sensible response. But the most important thing that anyone can do right now is to get boosted.
Ministers have been given a stark warning by SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, that without further intervention, the scale of hospital admissions due to Omicron would almost certainly lead to unsustainable pressure on the NHS. The scenarios for curbing Omicron are an echo of lockdown controls from earlier this year, including closing indoor hospitality and limits on mixing of households.
You don't have time to dither. This thing is coming at us like an express train. There is no evidence yet to be clear in suggesting it's less serious, and if we wait, we could be in a real crisis.
And that is the dilemma for ministers. Do they wait until the threat from Omicron becomes clear and hope to avoid lockdown measures, or act now as a precaution and risk the wrath of many in their own party and beyond Westminster? Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, will take responsibility for the UK's post-Brexit negotiations with the EU following the abrupt resignation of Lord Frost last night. Lord Frost said he was unhappy with the direction of Boris Johnson's government and urged the Prime Minister not to impose what he called the coercive COVID measures seen in some other countries. Any new restrictions in England would have to be approved by the House of Commons, and that would mean bringing MPs back to Westminster from their Christmas break. Our political correspondent Damien Grammaticus looks at the challenges for the Prime Minister in the coming days.
Lord Frost, I'm Ratcliffe from the BBC. Can I ask you a few questions, please? Can I ask why you've resigned from the government, Lord Frost? Do you believe that Boris is still fit to lead?
He wasn't answering today, but Lord Frost's resignation came at a terrible time for the Prime Minister. On Boris Johnson's behalf, he'd been at the forefront of the ongoing battles with Brussels and was admired by many Tory MPs who today said they shared Lord Frost's concerns, including his dislike of new COVID restrictions.
Many of the things that he worries about, I and many of my colleagues worry about. We want to see the Conservative Party as a low-tax party going forward, and we don't want our civil liberties to be restricted.
Mr Johnson has moved fast to hand Lord Frost's negotiating responsibilities to Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, also popular in Tory ranks for the trade negotiations she's done since Brexit. But recent revelations have damaged Mr Johnson, like this video of his staff joking leaked to ITV News. Today, another leak to The Guardian. The Downing Street garden in May 2020 with bottles of wine. Rules at the time said only 2 could meet outside socially. Number 10 says this was a work meeting. And the shock by-election loss in North Shropshire. To pass new measures, Mr Johnson will have to recall Parliament.
If the government felt that further action had to be taken, of course, we would present that to Parliament and it would be for Parliament to decide.
Noes to the left, 126.
But this week, 100 Tories already voted against the latest measures, so a new vote could see even more rebels.
He's got over 100 Conservative MPs who are holding him to ransom, are saying they won't even vote for the most mild restrictions that we voted on in Parliament this week. And so the government is paralysed because of the Conservative Party's political problems and because of the Prime Minister's weakness. And that's a very worrying situation for the country to find itself in.
So the Prime Minister faces hard choices and political headaches deciding what to do, even as the Omicron wave builds. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News.
We'll talk to Damien in just a moment. Before that, let's look at the latest official data on the pandemic in the UK. There were 82,886 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. The average over the past week is now more than 78,000 new cases every day. 45 deaths were recorded of people who died within 28 days of a positive test. 111 COVID-related deaths were recorded on average every day in the past week. On vaccinations, nearly 700,000 people a day had boosters on average in the past 7 days, bringing the total now to more than 28 million. Now, as we mentioned earlier, more money has been allocated to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland for their efforts to control the pandemic. As I mentioned, Damien's back with me now to talk a little more about the money first then, Damien, and of course about the challenges facing Boris Johnson this week.
That's right, Huw. Well, the money, we know the government is saying it's doubling this funding. The Scottish government say that they are asking for urgent clarification about whether this was new money or an advance on funding, which they would have expected anyway. Now, there was that meeting this afternoon between the devolved administrations and London. We were thinking signals might come from that. What we're hearing is that that was not really about restrictions. It was about how to deal with the fallout of staff shortages and that sort of thing. Nicola Sturgeon tweeted after it saying she wanted urgent decisions to be made. But the Prime Minister is under pressure from all sides. The Health Secretary saying they need to take in many different things, not just the scientists' advice, but other things into the picture too. The impact of any new lockdown measures. And, of course, those MPs saying lockdowns should not be the default choice that the government resorts to. So, difficult decisions. OK, Damien. Many thanks again. Damien Grammaticus there. Well, the Netherlands has embarked on a month-long lockdown in response to the surge in cases of Omicron. It's the first European country to introduce this level of restrictions in response to the new variant. Non-essential shops, bars, gyms, hairdressers, other public venues will be closed. All schools will be shut until at least the 9th of January, while other lockdown measures will remain in place until at least the 14th of January. Our correspondent Anna Holligan reports from The Hague.
Virtually silent high streets. It's online and window shopping only this year. Last Christmas, the Dutch thought the pandemic would be over by now. Instead, the Netherlands has become the first country in Europe to shut down in response to the rapidly spreading Omicron variant.
And now it feels like it's starting all over again, to be isolated, and yeah, it feels very bad.
Because we used to go to cafe, to bar, and with this lockdown, it's impacted me a bit. So yeah, it's a little bit difficult.
George is a chef.
So tomorrow I'm working just to throw away a lot of fresh food, lots of basically everything that we can't sell anymore, so that's...
The Dutch Prime Minister described this lockdown as an unavoidable response to Omicron. Across the border in Germany, most travellers from Britain are now banned from entering the country to try to halt the transmission of Omicron. German nationals and residents will still be allowed to arrive from the UK, but must have a negative test and quarantine for 2 weeks, regardless of their vaccination status. France has already introduced similar restrictions to try to cut COVID cases crossing the Channel. In Denmark, which has registered more Omicron cases than any other European country, apart from Britain, theatres, cinemas and amusement parks will be closed for the next months. And in Belgium, thousands paraded through the capital, Brussels, to demonstrate their discontent with the compulsory COVID access passes that must be shown in bars and restaurants. For now, the UK is holding back on tightening the measures. But in the face of record-breaking infection rates, the Health Secretary has refused to rule anything out. Anna Holligan, BBC News in The Hague.
In Chile, the polling stations have now closed in the country's most divisive presidential elections since the end of General Pinochet's military rule over 30 years ago. Voters have been choosing between a former left-wing student activist and a hard-right lawyer who has been likened to Donald Trump. Well, for the latest there, let's join our South America correspondent Katie Watson, who's in the capital, Santiago.
Well, 30% of votes have been counted. 54% of those votes have gone to Gabriel Boric, the leftist former student protester. And certainly we're at his camp here and people feel that he's won already. We've been speaking to lots of analysts who've also called his victory. But this was a very divisive vote. It was everything to play for. Just in the first round, 47% of Chileans voted. There were an awful lot of undecided voters. But the Chileans had to decide between two very different candidates.
In his closing rally, José Antonio Cast stuck to his well-trodden narrative that Chile will never be ruled by communists. It's an inaccurate slight against his rival, but a fear many people have in Santiago's wealthier neighbourhoods. This is the man he's talking about, Gabriel Boric, a former protest leader and activist turned politician, whose coalition includes the Communist Party.
We don't have to be afraid of the organization of the people. No, we have to learn from history, but not to do it again, not to repeat it.
These elections have revived the ghost of Chile's past, that the left is communist, the right fascist. And Cast has been hit by recent revelations that his father was a member of Hitler's Nazi party. He's also talked fondly of General Pinochet, a man responsible for thousands of deaths and disappearances during Chile's dictatorship in the 70s and 80s. A man the UK has history with. In 1998, he was detained in London on murder charges and subsequently visited by his friend Margaret Thatcher. 2 years ago, a rise in the cost of transport sparked protests and wider calls for change. The legacy of the dictatorship may have been a stable economy, but one that failed to benefit everyone.
This has always been the focal point for the protests, but they weren't just about a 30 peso rise in the price of an underground ticket. That's 3 pence. But it was bigger than that. It was 30 years of indifference, of inequalities for millions of people here. And these elections are about building a different future.
Much of Boric's support base comes from those who've been excluded the most.
We have to change. We don't want to live in a repressive world. We have already done that. We don't want to go back 30 years.
But Gonzalo Pinochet, a distant cousin of the former dictator, disagrees.
I think that populism is something really, really bad that's been happening in our continent. The dictatorship is part of our history, and we cannot deny that. But now we're in 2021.
These elections have pushed people to choose extremes, the side they fear the least. But for plenty of Chileans, neither candidate represents them. The winner will have a challenge to unite this country. Katie Watson, BBC News in Santiago.
A Conservative MP has been arrested following a car crash last month. Jamie Wallace, the MP for Bridgend in South Wales, said he was assisting police with their inquiries following a collision when a car hit a lamppost. Police said the man, aged 37, had been released under investigation. At least 108 people are now known to have died in a typhoon that struck the Philippines on Thursday, the most powerful storm to reach the country this year. More than 300,000 people were forced to leave their homes as winds reached more than 120 miles an hour. Search and rescue efforts are continuing in the worst affected areas. In Australia, police say a sixth child has died as a result of an accident with a bouncy castle which happened in Tasmania. The 11-year-old boy was among a group of children who fell about 10 metres when the inflatable structure was lifted off the ground by a gust of wind. They'd been celebrating at an end-of-term school party. In Hong Kong's first election since China increased its control over the territory, turnout was at a record low according to officials in the region. Just over 30% of those eligible to vote went to the polls. All candidates were approved by Beijing, and those judged to be unpatriotic were not allowed to stand, leading some activists to urge people to boycott the vote. Full results are not expected until Monday. One of the world's best known and most influential architects, Richard Rodgers, who designed some of the most striking buildings of the past half-century, has died at the age of 88. He came to international prominence in the 1970s with the pioneering design of the Pompidou Centre in Paris. Our correspondent David Silito looks back at his life.
It's hard to exaggerate what a shock this building was. The Pompidou Centre's facade with its confusion of pipes, ducts and external corridors was revolutionary. The work of Renzo Piano and a young British architect called Richard Rodgers.
The building itself is inside out. In other words, what you usually see inside, which are those long, dank, dark corridors which you have in big institutional buildings, and that is an institution, theoretically, though I dislike the word. It's an institution. There's long, dark corridors on the outside. They're actually the fun.
The inside-out design made the interior airy and open, and equally important was the public space outside. This was 60s egalitarianism, inspired by the piazzas of his hometown, Florence, in Italy. His parents had arrived in Britain in the 30s. The young Richard Rodgers struggled at school. He was dyslexic, but he got into art college and then trained as an architect, where he met another future superstar of British architecture, Norman Foster.
My oldest and closest friend, collaborator, architect, humanist, extraordinary individual. But also not just an architect on individual buildings, but a passionate supporter of the city, of the sustainable city, the compact, pedestrian-friendly city.
Huge variety. When you go from the Pompidou Centre to something like the Millennium Dome or Terminal 5, was there a vision that ran through all of these buildings?
Oh, without doubt. I mean, if Richard as a personality was generous and outgoing and in a way colourful, then his buildings reflected that personality.
Of course, not everyone shared his taste. The Lloyd's building provoked a variety of reactions, but the Welsh Zenith, Terminal 5 at Heathrow, the Millennium Dome. He leaves a huge visible legacy, but perhaps more important was his role in changing attitudes. From 70s decay to the urban renaissance, the Richard Rodgers vision. A city that was open, sociable, welcoming.
The tributes today to the influential British architect Richard Rodgers, who's died at the age of 88. Now, within the past hour, Emma Raducanu has been named BBC Sports Personality of the Year. The 19-year-old won the US Open in September, making her the first female British tennis player to win a Grand Slam title in 44 years. The boxer Tyson Fury, diver Tom Daley, swimmer Adam Peaty, footballer Raheem Sterling and Paralympic cyclist Dame Sarah Storey were all nominated. Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss watched the ceremony.
The 2021 BBC Sports Personality of the Year is Emma Raducanu.
Currently self-isolating with COVID, she had to present the trophy to herself. But then in 2021, Emma Raducanu's taken everything in her stride. Winning the US Open at just 18 is a feat which still almost defies belief. From a virtual unknown to a sporting sensation in one remarkable year.
It's been absolutely insane, and especially the energy that I felt at Wimbledon this year and playing in front of my home crowd. that was something that, you know, I've never felt before. So thank you very much.
Well, 2021's been a bumper year for sport, with an Olympics, a Paralympics and a Euros. And tonight was a chance to honour some of its new stars.
Sky Brown.
The Young Personality Award went to 13-year-old skateboarder Sky Brown, who in Tokyo became Britain's youngest ever Olympic medalist.
I want to inspire the world, especially little girls, and teach them that, you know, skateboarding is for everyone. I mean, if you believe in yourself, you can do anything.
It was also a good evening for the England men's football team. They won Team of the Year for reaching the Euros final, with Gareth Southgate Coach of the Year, while the Lifetime Achievement Award went to American gymnast Simone Biles. But this has been Emma Raducanu's year, and it was her night.
Emma Raducanu!
Andy Swiss, BBC News.
Well, with news of all the sport that's been taking place today, let's join Lizzie.
Thank you, Huw. Good evening. England's cricketers need a miraculous turnaround to avoid going 2-0 down in the Ashes series. They'll start the final day of the second test against Australia 4 wickets down and needing another 386 runs to win. Patrick Geary reports.
For Joe Root and England, it's the Ashes tour which keeps getting more sore. How on earth do they get up from this? Root had also been hit there in the warm-up, so was missing when Joss Buttler helped England try to keep hold of Australia. The captain returned to a phony war. The Aussies scoring runs that they probably wouldn't need and waiting for the right time to put England in. 467 runs ahead, they declared game on. Forget winning, England had to survive more than 4 sessions to draw. Haseeb Hameed only made it through 6 balls. Still, keep smiling because David Malan's in form until he was also in line. LBW. English batsmen tend to come and go in flocks. Rory Burns fought for 34, then took flight, 3 down. At least they still had Root, officially the world's best batter and England's strongest point. But Australia found his weakest spot. Last over before the close, and England's captain tried to stay patient in the pain. It's a cruel game. To win the test, Australia need just 6 wickets, and they have all day to take them. Patrick Geary, BBC News.
Match of the Day 2 is on after the news, so don't listen if you want to wait for the day's Premier League results. Manchester City have stretched their lead at the top of the table to 3 points. They thrashed Newcastle 4-0, and their nearest rivals Liverpool were held to a 2-2 draw at Tottenham. That game definitely one to watch later, with plenty of drama and incident. Elsewhere, Wolves-Chelsea was 0-0. Celtic have won the Scottish League Cup for the 20th time. They beat Hibernian 2-1 at Hampden Park, as Adam Wilde reports.
It's been some time since Scottish football had a full house for a cup final. The noise at Hampden suggested those there were making the most of it. They had to wait, though, for the game the occasion deserved. Paul Hanlon eventually heading Hibernian in front with a determination matched only by his jubilation. It was a lead that lasted little over a minute. Kyogo Furuhashi finally taking a Celtic chance. The control perfect, the finish unstoppable. If that was impressive, his second was quite exquisite. Only 1 touch needed this time, and Celtic in front for the first time. They'd hang on, if only just. Hibs going agonisingly close. Still, this was Celtic's day, scenes that have been a long time coming. Adam Wilde, BBC News.
There's much more on the BBC Sport website, including a 13th consecutive win for Leicester Tigers, this time in Europe's Champions Cup. But that's the sport.
Lizzie, many thanks once again. More throughout the evening on the BBC News channel. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.